Have you ever noticed how someone can promise they'll never leave, and yet a small part of you still prepares for the possibility that they will? Maybe someone takes a little too long to reply, and your mind quietly starts connecting dots that don't exist. Maybe you want closeness more than anything, but the moment someone gets too close, something inside you pulls back. Or maybe you've become the person who says, "I trust people," while secretly double-checking everything they say. Trust issues often look like suspicion, but surprisingly, they're usually not about distrust at all. They're about protection. And once you understand what your mind is actually trying to protect, the behavior begins to make a lot more sense. Because people with trust issues aren't necessarily afraid of other people. They're often afraid of what happens when they let their guard down. If this sounds familiar, you're not broken. You're not overly dramatic. You're not impossible to love. In fact, your brain may be doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you from pain. The difficult part is that the same system that protects us can sometimes continue working long after the danger is gone. And that's where trust issues usually begin. Not with weakness, not with insecurity, but with adaptation. Think about how trust is supposed to develop. As children, we slowly learn whether the world feels predictable, whether people mean what they say, whether emotional safety exists. When those experiences are consistent, trust begins to feel natural. But when experiences become unpredictable, something different happens. The brain starts paying closer attention. It becomes alert, observant, careful, not because it's trying to ruin relationships, because it's trying to prevent future hurt. And often, trust issues don't show up immediately after disappointment. They appear later, when someone new enters your life, when a relationship starts becoming meaningful, when you finally have something worth losing. That's usually when the old protective system wakes up, because emotional risk has returned, and the brain remembers. You might notice it when someone genuinely cares about you. Instead of feeling relieved, you feel nervous. Instead of relaxing into connection, you start searching for signs that something might go wrong. This can feel confusing. After all, isn't trust supposed to make you feel safe? Yes, but for someone who's been hurt before, safety itself can sometimes feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things often feel dangerous. The nervous system doesn't always prioritize happiness. It prioritizes predictability, even if that predictability hurts. That's why some people find themselves expecting disappointment, not because they enjoy it, because part of their mind would rather anticipate pain than be surprised by it. Preparation feels safer than vulnerability. And that brings us to something most people never realize. Trust issues aren't always about other people. Sometimes they're about your relationship with uncertainty. Because trusting someone requires accepting something uncomfortable. You cannot control what another person chooses to do. You can love them, understand them, support them, but you cannot fully predict them. And for a mind that has learned to associate unpredictability with pain, that uncertainty can feel overwhelming. So the brain creates strategies. Maybe you keep emotional distance. Maybe you test people. Maybe you analyze every interaction. Maybe you stay ready for disappointment. These behaviors can look irrational from the outside, but internally, they're serving a purpose. They're creating the illusion of control, and control often feels safer than hope. You see this everywhere in modern life. Someone gets cheated on once and struggles to trust future partners. Someone gets betrayed by a close friend and starts assuming hidden motives. Someone opens up emotionally and gets rejected, then spends years avoiding vulnerability. The behavior changes, but the psychological pattern remains the same. Pain teaches caution. The brain remembers the lesson, and then it keeps teaching it, even when the classroom no longer exists. But here's the part nobody tells you. Trust issues are often evidence that trust once mattered deeply. People who truly don't care rarely worry about betrayal. The fear exists because connection matters. The anxiety exists because relationships matter. The caution exists because vulnerability matters. Underneath the protective walls is usually someone who values trust tremendously. Someone who knows how painful it feels when trust breaks. And that's an important distinction, because trust issues are often misunderstood as coldness. In reality, they're frequently connected to sensitivity. The more meaningful a connection becomes, the more risk it carries. And the more risk it carries, the more the brain wants protection. That's why trust issues can feel strongest in relationships that actually matter. Not because the relationship is unhealthy, because the emotional stakes are high. And this is where things get even more interesting. As people age, trust issues often evolve. In your younger years, trust issues may look obvious. Jealousy, overthinking, seeking reassurance, wanting certainty. But later in life, they can become quieter, more sophisticated. Instead of questioning others, you question yourself. Instead of fearing abandonment directly, you avoid situations where abandonment could happen. Instead of asking for reassurance, you convince yourself you don't need anyone. The behavior changes shape, but the underlying need remains remarkably similar. Safety, protection, predictability. That's one reason trust issues can feel so confusing. You think you've outgrown them, but they've simply adapted. The brain is incredibly creative when it comes to self-protection. It finds new ways to build the same walls. And often, those walls become part of identity. You start seeing yourself as independent, guarded, self-reliant, careful, strong. And many of those qualities genuinely are strengths. But sometimes they began as survival strategies. Ways to prevent emotional injury. Ways to avoid disappointment. Ways to stay safe. The interesting thing about emotional protection is that it rarely feels like protection while it's happening. It simply feels like who you are. That's why trust issues can become invisible to the person experiencing them. They don't feel like defenses. They feel like common sense. Of course you should be careful. Of course you shouldn't rely on people too much. Of course you should prepare for the worst. The beliefs feel logical because they were built from real experiences. And that's what makes them so powerful. But underneath all of it is something surprisingly human. A nervous system trying to regulate itself. A mind trying to reduce uncertainty. A person trying to avoid pain. Think of trust issues like carrying an emotional umbrella. At some point, there was a storm. The umbrella helped. It protected you. And because it worked, you kept carrying it. Eventually, carrying it became normal, comforting, familiar. Even on sunny days, the umbrella wasn't the problem. It was a response. A reasonable response to weather that once felt dangerous. And in many ways, trust issues function similarly. They reduce emotional exposure. They provide a sense of control. They create predictability in situations that feel uncertain. They become a familiar room inside an unpredictable world. An old friend that promises protection. An anchor in emotional chaos. The brain loves familiarity, even when familiarity isn't perfect. Because familiar things require less energy, less risk, less uncertainty. And trust issues often provide exactly that. Not happiness, not peace, but predictability. And for a protective brain, predictability can feel remarkably close to safety. Which brings us to something important. People with trust issues are often carrying a story about themselves that isn't entirely true. A story that says they're difficult, complicated, damaged, too cautious, too sensitive, too guarded. But when you look closer, something different appears. You see adaptation. You see resilience. You see a mind that learned from experience and tried its best to keep going. Maybe imperfectly, maybe protectively, but human beings have always done this. We build defenses around our wounds. We create patterns around our fears. We search for safety wherever we can find it. That's not weakness. That's humanity. So if you've ever struggled to trust people, maybe the most important thing to understand is this. Your mind wasn't trying to sabotage your life. It was trying to protect your heart. The behavior may be frustrating, confusing, exhausting at times, but it didn't appear for no reason. It appeared because some part of you learned that caution felt safer than vulnerability. And whether that lesson came from relationships, friendships, family experiences, or disappointments that nobody else fully understands, the response itself makes sense. Because trust issues are rarely about being incapable of trust. They're usually about knowing exactly how much trust can hurt when it's broken. And that awareness doesn't make you flawed. It makes you human. A human being navigating uncertainty the best way they know how. A human being searching for safety. A human being carrying old protections into new chapters. And perhaps that's the most comforting truth of all. Behind every trust issue is not a broken person. Just a person whose brain learned to protect what mattered. It makes you human. A human being navigating uncertainty the best way they know how. A human being searching for safety. A human being carrying old protections into new chapters. And perhaps that's the most comforting truth of all. Behind every trust issue is not a broken person. Just a person whose brain learned to protect